Curtis Edward Smith, known as Cousin Eddie, stands accused of not only being Alex Murdaugh's drug connect, but also assisting Alex in his attempted suicide. As police dig into the case, the investigation leads to a twisted road of drugs, forgery, and money laundering. Then, nearly a year after the incident, a failed lie detector test begs the question, was Curtis Edward Smith a second gunman in the Moselle murders? Welcome to Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite, Murdaugh, Episode 10, The Connect. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite. I am your host, Jim Chapman, and today we are continuing the Murdaugh series with our 10th episode. And I'm going to name this episode The Connect. Before I get into it, quickly, I want to thank everyone for sharing. We continue to grow by leaps and bounds every week, it seems. And that is all because of all of you that support the show. I love interacting with y'all on the Facebook page. So go check out our Facebook if you are new to the podcast. I keep it very active, and a lot of people participate after they listen to the episodes in the comments. It's really good stuff. So go check that out. If you'd like to help support the show, we have a celebrity team, and there's several different tiers. You get everything from commercial-free early releases to bonus episodes to files that we actually talk about on the show. If you're a member of our global celebrity team, you get a quarterly gift. All kinds of cool stuff there, so go check it out. And lastly, I've had a lot of people ask about merch. They want some exposed t-shirts and other types of merch. So yes, I do have some merch that I'm going to start putting up on the Patreon for purchase, as well as some other outlets. And so stay tuned for that. I'm going to try to get everything up in the next couple of weeks. And it would make a great Christmas gift for that person in your life that enjoys listening to podcasts and listening to Exposed, or even for yourself. So get ready for that. Now, let's get into it. The last time I left you, Alex Murdaugh had admitted to the staging of his own suicide to SLED investigators, and he mentioned a name, and that name was Curtis Edward Smith. Now, he made some claims that Curtis Edward Smith was his drug dealer and that he was massively addicted to opiates. As you would expect, SLED started getting their ducks in a row because they wanted to obviously speak to Curtis Edward Smith. Now, just a few days later, on September 14th of 2021, police do obtain an affidavit for arrest for Curtis Edward Smith, and it was for 5 separate charges. The first was conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The second was insurance fraud itself. The third was pointing and presenting a firearm. The fourth was assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. And the last was assisted suicide. So I actually have my hands on the actual affidavits, and it reads like this. Affidavit number 1 says, description of offense, assisted suicide. That on September 4th of 2021 in the town of Varnville County of Hampton, state of South Carolina, one Curtis Edward Smith did commit the offense of assisted suicide. And then it goes into the violation code. That on September 4th, 2021, co-defendant Richard Murdaugh conspired with Curtis Edward Smith for the purpose of Mr. Smith assisting Mr. Murdaugh to commit suicide, in that Mr. Murdaugh provided Mr. Smith with a firearm and directed Mr. Smith to shoot him in the head for the purpose of causing Mr. Murdaugh's death and allowing for the payment of a stated death benefit to a beneficiary of the insured. It says Mr. Smith followed Mr. Murdaugh to a road and shot Mr. Murdaugh as he stood in the roadway. After shooting Mr. Murdaugh in the head, Mr. Smith drove to an unknown location where he disposed of the firearm. Mr. Murdaugh survived the shooting and was transported to the hospital for treatment. On September 13th of 2021, Mr. Murdaugh provided a statement to SLED admitting the scheme of having Mr. Smith murder him for the purpose of his son collecting life insurance. On September 14th, Mr. Smith admitted to being present during the shooting of Mr. Murdaugh and to disposing of the firearm afterward. That is unlawful for a person to assist another person committing suicide. A person assists another person in committing suicide if the person provides the physical means by which the other person commits or attempts to commit suicide, or participates in a physical act which the other person commits or attempts to commit suicide. And it's a signed affidavit. And then all of the other affidavits, they're all very similar. As a matter of fact, most of it looks like is just copy and paste. The only part that changes is where they talk about it being unlawful and they kind of go into the charge. So I'm just going to read that on the rest of these. In relation to the assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, it says a person commits the offense of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature if the person unlawfully injures another person and the act is accomplished by means likely to produce great bodily harm or death. Then it goes into the pointing and presenting a firearm, and it says it is unlawful for a person to present and point at another person a loaded or unloaded firearm. Then it goes into the insurance fraud. It reads that it is unlawful for a person to knowingly make false statements or misrepresentation and any other person knowingly with an intent to injure, defraud, or deceive, or who assists, solicits, or conspires with a person to make false statements or misrepresentation for an economic advantage or benefit in connection to an insurance transaction. So that's how that one reads. And finally, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. And it says a person commits the offense of conspiracy when they act in combination with each other for the purpose of accomplishing an unlawful object or lawful object by unlawful means. That it is unlawful for a person to knowingly make false statements, misrepresentations, and any other person knowingly with an intent to injure, defraud, or deceive. So essentially the same thing, but the fact that they planned it in advance. They conspired with each other, right? Now, immediately following the arrest of Curtis Edward Smith, SLED released a news release. Look, this is big news all over South Carolina and all over the country, really. And as the comments prove, as I've been going along in this series, it just keeps getting crazier and crazier. So everybody's paying attention at this point. So SLED releases a news release and it says agents of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Tuesday arrested a Colleton County man in connection with the shooting involving Alex Murdaugh on September 4th in Hampton County. Curtis Edward Smith, 61, was charged with assisted suicide, assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature, pointing and presenting a firearm, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Additional charges are expected and will be announced at the appropriate time. Smith has also been charged with distribution of methamphetamine and possession of marijuana. The SLED investigation was requested by the Hampton County Sheriff's Office. Smith was booked into the Colleton County Detention Center, and the case will be prosecuted by the Attorney General's Office. Curtis Edward Smith, obviously at this point, he is arrested. And now that this news release has been put out there was a short article covering it by the New York Times. And it said Alex Murdaugh, a prominent South Carolina lawyer who is at the center of multiple investigations after his wife and son were shot and killed at his family home in June, plans to turn himself in on Thursday on charges that he staged his own assassination, even as he continued to deny involvement in killing of his family. One of Murdaugh's lawyers, Jim Griffin, said Mr. Murdaugh faces charges including conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and lying to the police in connection with the September 4th incident in which Mr. Murdaugh admitted asking a client to shoot him so his son could collect on a $10 million insurance policy. In the roadside shooting earlier this month, Mr. Murdaugh survived a gunshot wound to the head and concocted a fake story about being shot by a passerby, a tale that his lawyers now admit were false. The police arrested the former client they say shot him, Curtis Edward Smith, 61, on Tuesday and charged him with assisting Mr. Murdaugh in attempting suicide, among other crimes. Dick Harpootlian, another lawyer for Mr. Murdaugh, was adamant that Mr. Murdaugh had not been involved in the slaying of his wife and son in June. He said Mr. Murdaugh had concocted the suicide plan because he was suffering from depression while trying to halt an oxycodone addiction. All right, so now they're both in jail, Alex Murdaugh and Eddie Smith. And Eddie Smith, he wants to get out, right? So when you get arrested and you go to jail, generally you're going to have a bond hearing pretty quickly. And the judge, he's going to determine whether you should be released on that bond. However, in Eddie Smith's case, and I would say primarily because of how nationally well known this case was becoming, initially, they revoke his bond. He's going to have to sit in jail for quite a while, and we'll get to that more later on. Now, as you would expect, at this point, everybody has their eyes on this case, law enforcement and media alike. They all wanted to know who in the hell Eddie Smith was, and there were a lot of people that thought, hey, if there were two killers involved in the double murder at Moselle, this sure could be the other guy, right? But we'll get back to that. Let's get into who Eddie Smith is. So everyone called Curtis Edward Smith Eddie, and Alex actually affectionately referred to him as Cousin Eddie. So Eddie had known Alex since the early to mid 80s. And according to Eddie, he was a distant cousin of Alex Murdaugh's. Now, over the time that he knew Alex and as they became friends, he would work for Alex as kind of like an errand runner, kind of a jack of all trades, and was really good at working with his hands. He helped Alex around the Moselle property a lot with cutting trenches for drainage, etc. around the property. He ran a lot of errands for Alex as well. So, of course, when the police showed up, and they initially arrested Cousin Eddie, they wanted to know how the whole deal went down with regard to the shooting. And so here's the story that Cousin Eddie tells them. He said it was around 10:45 in the morning that day, and Alex gives him a call and says, hey, can you meet me at, and get this, y'all, can you meet me at a funeral home of all places near Colleton County? And Eddie says, sure. He agrees and he heads out that way. He sees Alex parked and he pulls up next to him, gets out of the car, and as he's doing so, he approaches the driver's side window. Alex then takes the sun visor in his vehicle and he pulls it to cover some of the window. You know how you can pull it off of that little hinge? He does that. And then he rolls down his window, but he barely rolls it down. And Eddie says, what are you doing? And Alex responds, I don't want to be seen by anyone. And he claimed that Sled was watching him. Now, this is according to Cousin Eddie, y'all. But Eddie says at that point, he asked Alex why Sled would be watching him. And Alex said, well, because of everything that happened at Moselle. And Cousin Eddie said, what did happen at Moselle? And he claimed that Alex responded, things just got all fucked up, quote unquote. Now, is that the truth? Or is that just what Eddie was saying to the police to try to convince them that, hey, Alex did all this at Moselle. I had nothing to do with it. Well, who knows? Because Eddie, he's not exactly what you would call a great witness to have. Let's just say he's very full of shit on a lot of things he says. So it's at this point that Eddie says Alex told him, "I need you to shoot me and kill me." And he claims that he told Alex, "Hell no." And Alex told him, "Fine, then I'll do it myself." And he speeds off from the parking lot. So what does Eddie do? Well, Eddie jumps back in his vehicle and he claims he chased Alex down the side of the highway until Alex pulled over. And by the time he pulled up behind Alex, Alex had already gotten out of the car and approached Eddie's car. And so Eddie tells police that it was his plan to scare some sense into Alex. So Alex is sitting there saying, "You either shoot me or I'm going to shoot me." And they're kind of scuffling for the gun. And supposedly Eddie takes the gun and he fires it in the air. And when he did, he said Alex fell on the ground because it startled him and he basically busted the back of his head open. And he said, at that point, I just went home. So as the police are trying to ascertain not only Eddie's involvement in the shooting of Alex Murdaugh, but also his involvement in the drug side of Alex Murdaugh's life, of course, they ask Eddie about that. And Eddie claims that Alex would give him packages and he would deliver the packages. And sometimes the packages would make noises. And he said, I would shake them and I would hear, the sound of what is obviously pills on the inside, but I wasn't asking any questions. I'm just delivering packages, right? He said he would drop the packages off and he would make a couple $100 and everybody was happy. But Eddie had a problem. And that is, as the police started digging deeper and deeper, they found a bunch of checks that were cashed by Eddie Smith and made out to Eddie Smith from shell accounts that Alex Murdaugh had set up. And oddly enough, the name of these companies, and one in particular, was called Forge. That's an arrogant son of a bitch right there. And I know I've mentioned this before, but you're going to name your company Forge, which is pretty much a synonym for fake, and you're setting up a fake account. That just blew my mind. But regardless of that, he wrote a bunch of checks to Eddie. And I'm not just talking about $5,000 worth. As a matter of fact, over the years, when they totaled up the checks he had written to Eddie Smith since 2015 until 2021, those checks added up to a staggering $1.3 million. So Eddie Smith, he's got problems because now he's got money laundering issues at his feet. And when Sled asked Eddie point blank, didn't you realize that this was money laundering? He said, yeah, he realized that. But according to Eddie, when he tried to quit doing these things, Alex threatened to do something to hurt his daughter. He would just make innuendo, never came out and said, I'm going to hurt your daughter if you stop working for me. But he would say things like, I know where your daughter lives and things like that. There was something interesting as it relates to the double murders at Moselle that the police also found when they were digging into all this check writing. So the month leading up to the murders, Eddie cashed a rather large check. It was larger than any of the checks he had cashed prior. And it was for nearly $25,000. And the police, they're thinking maybe this was a payoff for him to help with the murders, possibly. So they asked him about it. And he said he had no idea why the check was so large. He said, my role was I simply cashed the check and gave cash back to Alex, and I would keep a certain amount of that, whatever percentage, I guess, Alex Murdaugh agreed that he could keep. And there was something else very strange, and that is on May 5th of 2022, Eddie Smith takes a lie detector test with the police, and he fails it. As a matter of fact, I have what's known as a motion to compel And that motion to compel was filed by Alex Murdaugh's defense team. And they wanted the story on that failed lie detector test, because obviously if Eddie Smith failed a lie detector test, it may point to another killer, or at least give some doubt in the eyes of a jury, possibly, that Alex Murdaugh did this horrible crime. So I'm going to read that to you. And here it is. So in the background, it says on June 7th of 2021, Alex Murdaugh's wife, Maggie, and youngest son, Paul, were murdered at the family property at Moselle. Alex's shock and grief exacerbated his narcotics addiction, and on September 4th of 2021, he asked his drug dealer, Curtis Eddie Smith, to shoot him in the head so his oldest son, Buster, would receive a life insurance payment. Smith agreed and shot Alex in the head, but the bullet grazed Alex's skull and did not kill him. Smith was charged with shooting Alex Murdaugh in the head as part of a conspiracy to assist Alex in committing suicide. Smith has also been charged with narcotics trafficking. The state assumed Alex guilty of the murders before reviewing any evidence, but failed to find evidence supporting that assumption, despite an investigation lasting more than a year. Nonetheless, on July 14th of 2022, the Attorney General caved to intense public interest in this case and indicted Alex with the murders. According to the state, Alex acted alone. During those 13 months between the murders and the indictment of Alex, however, the state sporadically investigated Smith's role. On September 7th of 2021, SLED executed a search warrant at Smith's home in Walterboro for evidence related to his role in the September 4th shooting of Alex. And on or about September 8th of 2021, search warrants were served regarding Smith's cell phone and cell phone providers. The warrant affidavits state Smith stated he deleted his call logs and text messages several times during the day. That's kind of weird if you're not doing something nefarious, right? Who deletes their text and call logs several times during the day as a habit? We continue. On May 5th of 2022, almost a year after the murders of Maggie and Paul, SLED agents interviewed Smith about Maggie and Paul's murder. A SLED agent, Captain Brian Jones, interviewed Smith for 54 minutes before the polygraph. After nearly 40 minutes of preliminary explanations and small talk, Captain Jones stated, "Eddie, what's your understanding of why you're here today?" To which Smith responded, "So I can do this here," referring to the polygraph test. Smith then continued, unprompted by any question, to offer an alibi. "I know I was nowhere near the place where Maggie and Paul got killed at." Then he was asked, "What do you already know about Maggie and Paul's death?" To which he responded with a detailed story blaming Paul and an unnamed groundskeeper. Quote, "I heard that Maggie had a thing going on with the groundskeeper, which I never met him, don't know his name. And Paul went down into one of the barns and caught him and got upset. And he went and got his rifle and was hollering and screaming at his mama. His mama was running and she fell down and then she got up. He shot her in the ass and the bullet came out the top of her head. And then he turned to the groundskeeper guy, but the groundskeeper had already went to his truck and got a shotgun." Captain Jones then asked Smith where he was that night. Smith said he was at his own home with many convenient alibi witnesses. Smith was prepared to detail his alibi. He said, "There's people in my house till about 9:15, 9:30 that night anyway. Steve Hudson was there. Donna was at the house. You know, she said we slept together and we were working on a Peterbilt truck that day and helped Kevin put a number 4 injector," and then it quits quoting him at that point. Captain Jones then asked Smith if he shot Maggie or Paul, and he said no repeatedly. Captain Jones then told Smith the questions that would be asked during the polygraph examination, and after more small talk, they start the polygraph. Smith failed. The polygraph report notes responses indicate attempted deception to the following questions. Did you shoot either of those people at the property on Moselle Road? Did you shoot either of those people at the property on Moselle Road last June? Were you present when either of those people were shot at the Moselle property? In other words, Smith lied when asked, did you shoot Maggie or Paul? Lied when asked the same question a second time, and lied when asked if he was present when they were shot. The camera recording the polygraph examination briefly captured the results on Captain Jones' laptop showing the deception. For example, when Captain Jones asked, did you shoot either of those people at the property on Moselle Road? Smith indicated no. The apparent result when Smith gave that lie can be seen on the below screenshot showing Captain Jones' laptop in the bottom left corner. And I'll upload that to the Patreon for y'all so you can see the pictures. After the examination, Captain Jones told Smith he showed deception when answering the questions dealing with the Moselle property incident. Smith immediately responded, I got plenty of people to tell you I was home. I was nowhere near. I couldn't have been there. I couldn't have flew there and got there fast enough to commit those murders because Steve was at my house till 9:15, 9:20. When Captain Jones pressed Smith for an explanation, Smith insisted, ain't no way in hell anybody can put me there. And Eddie Smith was 35 miles away from that place. He also denied having any direct knowledge about the murders. I didn't have no direct knowledge about it. Captain Jones continued, it does look like you've got some direct knowledge or some participation in the murders. When he pressed Smith with, I think you're leaving something out, Smith became agitated, insisting, I wasn't there. There ain't no way, shape, or form nobody can put me there. I was not there. And it goes on. Smith provided 3 alibi witnesses, Donna Eason, Steve Hudson, and Kevin Salisbury. It does not appear Sled ever interviewed Donna Eason following the failed polygraph exam. Sled did interview Hudson and Salisbury, neither of whom provided a compelling alibi, in part because Sled waited 2 weeks before interviewing them, giving Smith an opportunity to tell them what to say. Sled interviewed Steve Hudson on May 17th of 2022, almost 2 weeks after Smith identified him as an alibi witness. Hudson had been friends with Smith for nearly 30 years. Sled contacted him on May 16th to request an interview. On May 17th, Hudson met with Smith to discuss the events of June 7th of 2021 before being interviewed by Sled. Hudson claimed that he was mowing grass for Smith at Smith's home until about 9:10 p.m. using the headlights on a lawnmower. Sled interviewed Walter Kevin Salisbury on May 20th of 2022, over 2 weeks after Smith identified him as an alibi witness. He said he was working on a truck at Smith's house on June 7th of 2021 until 10 or 11 p.m. Salisbury also stated that he had known Smith for 20 years. Smith had called him after the failed polygraph interview to say that Sled might be inquiring about his whereabouts on June 7th. And then they go on to discuss the fact they never interviewed the female. And it said, if Sled did interview her, this motion seeks to compel production of that interview. So there you have that motion to compel. And you can see look, the defense, absolutely correct. And they're doing their job, right? They're trying to point this crime at anybody else. But the issue is, and I'm not sure everyone listening may understand this, but lie detector tests are not admissible in court. And the reason for that is you do get false positives. I'm not saying that was the case here, but it happens more often than you think, as a matter of fact. And a lot of responsibility is on the person actually performing or administering the lie detector test. There is so much involved in that. And that's why they're not admissible in court. There's just too many parameters in a lie detector test that can go wrong and issue a false positive. So what happened to Eddie Smith? Well, eventually he gets released from jail. This was in April of 2023. And his case is still pending on the money laundering charges and all slew of other charges as well. And it's important to note that he never testified in Alex Murdaugh's trial. He's just not credible. He's the kind of guy, if you get him up there and then the defense gets a hold to him, they are going to expose him as a total liar, and it's going to do nothing but hurt your case if you are prosecuting Alex Murdaugh. So he never testified. There was a lot of talk at the beginning when Alex Murdaugh's trial first started that, is Curtis Edward Smith going to testify, etc. He never did. Now, I will tell you, if you want to learn more about him, he did a couple of interviews that you can Google. He did like a short interview with a news station that was local in South Carolina. And he also did, I believe it was 48 Hours or one of the primetime crime shows. You'll see what I'm talking about with the prosecution not finding him credible. He just seems like he's shady as fuck. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone for listening and supporting everything we do here at Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite. Check out the Patreon. Please, if you have not yet, give the podcast a rating. Look, we had a ton of ratings come through in the last couple of weeks, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please do so. Some exciting things coming up for Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite. And as we go on, I will be mentioning those. But I promise you, if you're enjoying the content, you're going to love it. It's just going to be more content for you here on Exposed. So stay tuned for that as we evolve. And until next time, for Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite, I'm your host, Jim Chapman. Much love.